on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we woman and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
Hey, hey. Oh, help us, Father. Hey, hey. The sun rises slowly over the hills. Everywhere is gold and sunlight, but still, most lights its hotels are crowded. Their days in dark clouds are shrouded. They don't smile and they never will. Only volunteers get their fill. Empty promises is what they hear. No running water from year to year. Hearts that no one desire. That if there is a Messiah, someday he'll hear their whispered prayer. Cupboard always bare and scanty. 10 people in a one-bedroom shanty. Forced to sell on the pavement. No vacancy, no employment. Cattle fire cracker from gunshots. Blood that's low when things get hot. Afraid to look out my window to hear voices from the ghetto. Crying, 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 crying. Voices from the ghetto. Crying, crying, crying. Hey, Lord, Lord. Crying, crying. Voices from the ghetto. Hey, hey. Oh, help us, Father. Oh, Lord. Mothers does just hold their head on, boy. And them woman stronger than a wall. A big bush of iron she daughter. Son in jail for manslaughter. Too bad for he and them bad boys. No bail, that's the black man's choice. Like Shadow say, poverty is hell. She little girl child belly start to swell. Some say life is a cycle, but the church in no circle. Where will it all end? Only time could tell. Outside the siren keep howling. Inside your belly will crawling. Police raid very often. The undertaker measuring a coffin. One night in bed you're sleeping. Next night is a wake that you're keeping. So you're praying to win the lotto, not to hear voices from the... What they doing? Crying. Tell me what they doing. Crying. Oh, Lord, Lord. Crying, 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 crying. Voices from the ghetto. Help us, Father. We are not a forgotten people, Lord. Stretch forth a hand to us, we pray. Come, God. Hey, come, God. Come, God. With dented pride, they sold their honor. Revolutions made politicians pawn. And often their tragic story brings a journalist glory. No wonder they view the world with scorn. since the day they're born. Some call them rebels without a cause. These social victims of unjust laws, but yet we christen we heroes, renegades, desperados, forever knocking on heaven's doors. Hear me? Steel band music shatters the silence, harmony to conquer the violence. Big men run when cops approach, fighting for scraps with the cockroach. Young Turks yet protecting, almost every young girl expecting. So tomorrow, Peck still a borrow. There'll be another voice from the ghetto, trust me. Crying, 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 yes, crying, 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 crying. Voices from the ghetto, crying, crying, crying. Oh, pity call, mama. Crying. Hear them pleading, Lord. Voices from the ghetto. Oh, yeah, help us, Father. Mm-hmm. Oh, social amenities, Lord, heaven knows. Opportunities, well, them always close. Can't get work once in white collar. So if you can't stretch your dollar, it's later for you crap or smoke your pipe. You're short or dead from gripe. Life does rape dignity and pride. Children's only bitterness left inside. And every day is a hustle. Arguments are settled with muscle till you're 6 feet deep by 3 feet wide. Children to life keep on drifting. It's something they're smoking or sniffing. Or maybe they're trying to forget this life of mystery and regret. No one to come to the rescue except Capleton and Boujou. So their boomboxes they let go to drum out voices from the ghetto. Crying, 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 crying. Voices from the ghetto. Crying, crying, yeah, crying, 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 crying. Voices from the ghetto. Hey, hey. Oh Lord, help us, Father. Oh, hey, hey. As parents struggle to survive, children are neglected and deprived. Illiteracy on the rampage. Some parents never reach college, so with his homework, the child must strive if he wants to stay alive. The dropout rate does come out trumps. As their big trucks skid and hit life bombs, them can't relate education to the daily life of starvation, so they take their chances in the dumps. Every day garbage truck they hop in is all junk and metal they scrapping to get a jump start on them Kobo. Some does get squashed like mosquito. So next time we pass in the beatum in we fancy car air condition, just above the Hummer we motor, we might hear a voice from the ghetto. Crying, 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 hey, crying, crying, crying.
Oh, welcome to today's edition of Politics 101, our special edition of Open Word, our special edition of Politics 101 on a Monday evening, and we continue to focus on poverty. We started last week. Singing Sandra Devines, Singing Sandra, Voices from the Ghetto, a portrait of poverty. That's what that calypso is, a portrait of poverty. The calypsonian coming at the issue from every angle. The Economist would be proud of what that calypso does in 6 verses, 5 verses. Voices from the Ghetto. A portrait of poverty. And we are focusing on poverty for the next week, because often we have our conversations about politics and we don't get to the heart of the matter. We talk about elections as an end. We want to talk about elections and all these other things as means towards that end. And one of the ends that we are talking about is ending poverty. They use a big word, you all know, alleviating poverty. And we feel that if we are able to do something about poverty, then and only then we can begin to talk about development and transformation. Development and transformation. You all remember that title there, Development and Transformation. Professor Thomas is one of his early books, Development and Transformation. Only then we can begin, once we start to talk about poverty. If we're talking about slavery, colonialism, indentureship, ultimately we must talk about poverty, because perhaps the most profound consequence of that long experience of bondage is the poverty which is still with us today. And we are saying in this era of actual and potential plenty, if we deal with the question of poverty, we're on our way. And who better to talk about poverty long before the oil started to pump? Professor Clive Thomas went to Buxton in 2018 and raised the question of poverty in a frontal way and made the argument that poverty could be attacked in a serious way and that we can decrease it in a serious way. It's called the Buxton Proposal. It's now, as they say, the rest of history is history. If there is one policy initiative that has come out of our conversations about oil and gas, it's the Buxton Proposal. Cash transfers. I go everywhere in the little corners, in the villages, in the ghettos, because now we have ghettos in the villages. They refer to it as the $5,000. So there's consciousness about it. And so we want to talk about poverty. We want to talk about the ghetto because we want to talk about poverty. We want to focus on poverty. Because this struggle is not just a struggle for power, political power. Of course, that's inherent in political interventions. But it has to be a struggle to solve problems, to transform the society. Whether you are in political power or out of political power, it is better when you are in the seat of power, because then you have the means by which to put into practice your policies. But as a people, we have to wrap our minds around policies and solutions and ideas. That's why we're talking about poverty this week. Because we want to be real. We want to be real. And you all know on Friday when we started this conversation, we opened the phones, or testimonies of people from the ghetto, people who live poverty every day. The sister that ended with our call, and she said, a big house may fool us. That what we're calling today the working class and working classes may have to undergo some change. She said, you may have a 3-bedroom house, 10 to 15 people inside, and they're catching hell in there. And the house is not always a reflection of a lack of poverty, the size of the house. And we reference Bob Marley. The pot a bile, but the food not plenty. Rain a fall, but the dirty tough. So we're going to talk about poverty with Professor Clive Thomas tonight. And I want you all to take these conversations seriously, because we are changing the way in which we engage politics, because Guyana is changing around us, the world is changing around us. And we have got to adjust to those changes. We've got to adjust all ideas. We've got to come up with new ideas. At the end of the day, ideas matter. You all know that. Ideas matter. Because you can get political power, and if you don't have ideas about what to do with that power to transform people's lives, you sit there in the seat of power and you leave the seat of power without affecting positive change for people who give you that power. Let me bring in Professor Clive Thomas. Professor Thomas, good evening.
Hello, David. Good evening, David. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. We had a long introduction tonight because we listened to Singing Sandra and what I call a portrait of poverty, and then my own commentary. As someone who has been thinking about poverty, not just from an academic standpoint, because as you have said on this program so many times, that you come out of poverty. All of us have. Some of us have left the ghetto a little bit earlier than others, but all of us came out of poverty. As you listen to that calypso, what went through your mind?
I think what went through my mind more than anything else is that Guyana is in a situation at this point in time where, with the resources that have been found in oil and gas, that we can bring every single person out of poverty, not only in Guyana, but in the rest of the West Indian nation. And I think it's a task that we should commit ourselves to undertaking. And we need a national vision and national support for undertaking that task. I think the calypso by Singing Sandra speaks to all the challenges that poor people have to suffer. And we've been suffering it for a long, long time. It has gone through many different permutations. But I think it would be a mistake on the part of those of us who are conscious of what our nation has been able to find in these discoveries of oil and gas, for us not to recognize that the region stands on the cusp of being in a position to obliterate poverty in all its main monetary dimensions from the face of the whole of the West Indian nation. And I feel that we should, in honor of our ancestors, try to stand up to that challenge. But first, we have to get recognition of the challenge. Many people are very flippant and saying that the poor will always be with us. There's a difference in saying the poor will always be with us when there's a persistent, significant section of your population that is always poor. But if you talk about a floating element shifting in nature and type over generations, that might always be with us. But to have a country in which a significant part the people live in grinding poverty is something that we can escape from as part of the collective endeavor of the entire planet. And I think we are at a point in time where the possibility of being able to do that is within the grasp of this generation. And I feel that's a challenge that we should take up. So all my work of the past and the present, and hopefully in the future, will be dedicated to that task.
And Professor, I am so glad that you made reference to your work in the past and the present and the future. And because going right back to your professional life in the 60s, coming through to the 1970s, Bread and Justice, coming through to the 1980s, The Poor and the Powerless, which was published in 1988, right through to the Buxton Proposal. Obviously, you've been thinking and writing about this question of poverty. So it's not a new thing that has come into being because we have oil. It's something that you have been writing and thinking about. And you've been associated with the Working People's Alliance. Before that, you were involved with Ratoon at the University of Guyana. And so mirroring your academic life as being your political activism, and the connection between the two is never lost in those who observe your interventions in Guyana, the Caribbean, and beyond. And I want you to speak to this work of this challenge, this work of tackling poverty and putting a dent and alleviating it, make the connection between that work and actual political activism for us.
I think the essence of that lies in something that a comment that someone had made to me in a public discussion when he was approving some remark I made years ago, maybe 20, 30 years ago. And he said there's nothing more practical, CY, as they call me, than a good idea. What I've learned here tonight is a good idea. And that has its own practical translation and shows a practical way forward. We're trying to achieve the thing that we are trying to do. So in fact, there's no separation between theory and practice. All good ideas are good practical things they put into operation. There's no ideal separation between something that is practical and something that is a good idea. Because human consciousness does not allow for this separation. Because as beings, we have to survive and we have to live and we have to grow. And the consciousness that we generate is the only independent product one can see in the universe that we can identify. Because everything they say that is here has always been here. The universe is what it is, a universe. But the only growing element in it that is not predetermined is the consciousness or the capabilities of the human mind to invent and see realities that might not exist in practice. But everything else that is supposed to exist can only exist when we recognize it. Because it is us that give recognition to reality. So I feel that it's an artificial separation. And most radical theorists have long recognized that. I have stood by ideas to try to see a dialectical connection between the two. That theory and practice really go together. So I feel this is a wrong abstraction to try to separate practice from theory or theory from practice. It runs the risk, I think, of serious error. And one of the ones that is most dangerous, I think, is when we begin to invent a reality. We begin to use our conscious mind to steer and construct a reality different from the one that our own intelligence is telling us is what is really there. We begin to fabricate and this and that and cater to this prejudice or that prejudice, and we lose the central guide which, which reflects the seriousness of revolutionary thinking, which seeks to advance the purpose and what people are trying to do. Once you slide into that trap, you don't get out of it because you have to spend all your intellect trying to reconstruct another reality. So I feel that recognizing this situation in Guyana is very important. And I think it's the path along which we should lead our struggles going forward. And there'll be many because a lot of people have no respect for the poor. Deep down, they think the poor people are vainglorious like themselves because it is mostly middle class people that do this. That they're willing to squander any wealth that they get. They're not serious. They prefer to go and drink and exploit rather than save the money to build the purpose of their lives with the people. Well, I could tell you I had a mother who had 7 children. 3 of us have doctorates. And she never went to high school. And she brought us up alone. So the seeds of ambition had to be there within the structure in which we're living. And we're all in different fields, and all of them share a radical political perspective. But I'm the only one who will actually engage as an activist. So I think that type of reality shows that the working class is a germ that feeds the creativity within the West Indian nation. And that we, in fact, by trying to find a way of bolstering that, removing poverty, that we are in fact doing the best thing that we could do for our people and as a nation. That's my shorthand for philosophy for what we're doing.
Professor Clive Thomas here tonight. We're talking about poverty. We're covering poverty for this next week or so, putting the focus on poverty. Welcome to all of you to Politics 101 tonight, our podcast night. We are talking to Professor Clive Thomas, whether you're joining us from Guyana, inside Guyana, or outside of Guyana, the wider Caribbean, the wider West Indies. Welcome to our program tonight. Those of you who join us from the United States, it's Labor Day today. And I know in Brooklyn and Queens, you all had a ball today. And the fact that I see some of you on the program tonight, it meant that you party, but you still make time to come and engage in our mobilization and discussion. Happy Labor Day to those of you there in the United States. Welcome to those of you from Canada. From Canada, lots of you join us from Canada. Thank you all very much for coming on to Politics 101. We're covering poverty. We're talking about poverty. We are centering poverty in our discourse this week. Professor Clive Thomas, a lot of the conversation, because of events that are unfolding, have been unfolding in our country, has to do with slavery and indentureship and colonialism, the visit of the Gladstones to apologize to slavery to spark a whole brand new intervention in this long conversation about slavery and indentureship and colonialism. What I would like you to do is to make the linkage between the poverty that we are talking about today and those constructs, those systems, slavery, colonialism, indentureship, and their linkages to the poverty that we are confronting today and that we are arguing, you are arguing, can be alleviated in this era of oil and gas?
First of all, I point out more than anything else that it centers not only around what Guyana is doing, what Guyana can achieve, or the vision I have for the West Indian nation, but the global community, the United Nations itself, has embarked on global negotiations, and they have come to the position that poverty is the single biggest and most urgent challenge facing humanity. It dominates the linkage to the environmental challenges because in poor countries, environmental damage comes out worse than anywhere else. It makes the linkage between a lot of deviant human behavior, crime, exploitation, people smuggling, all of these deviant behaviors that are now prevalent in the world and dominate the headlines every day. All of these things are linked to poverty, either the source for financing or a source of exploitation of countries because they do not have the resources to monitor their coastlines, to monitor their population, to track down the criminal intrigue of international harbingers of poverty. So in a sense, what I have adopted as a leading point of departure for the region and for Guyana is indeed consistent with what the United Nations itself has elevated to become the most important problem confronting the world. Even the challenges of geopolitics hinge largely around that. So I'm happy to believe that all of the leading thinkers of humanity can't be wrong. And there must be something close to the truth in what we all have come to consider as being the single biggest challenges facing humankind at this point in time. So poverty to me is not only a choice Guyana has to make, but one that is consistent with the dominant trends in international development in global agencies that we all contribute to the construction of, and the global framework for the development of humankind. So I'm happy to be joining that company.
And the linkage between slavery and colonialism and poverty?
It's there because those were the initial conditions of our creation as a West Indian nation. But those took place in the context of a growing capitalism and colonialism that involved countries not only being exploited, not only the countries that were being exploited, but the countries engaged in the exploitation, the countries who traded and benefited from that exploitation, the countries who brought other countries who were at that point in time not even recognized as being countries that existed into the global network of countries. Probably over 200 nations at this point in time, now in the form of nation states. And that did not exist when the first voyages took place to bring slaves to the Caribbean area. So all that evolution is part and parcel of that early conquest. We have to link the creation of poverty and the generation of, while differences in the distribution of income and wealth across the world, the distribution of power and influence You have to bring all those things to bear in understanding why it is poverty to be so central and so well embedded and persistent in its embeddedness in the Caribbean region.
Professor Thomas, in that Calypso Rose, I think, as you said, she dealt with the challenges of poverty, the challenges poor people have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And she talked about survival, and she talked about finding ways and means of staying alive, finding ways and means of trying to get out of poverty. And you talked earlier about middle class biases and maybe prejudices against poor people, in the sense that poor people are painted as people who do not think about how to overcome poverty. Talk about the poor and their continued struggle to survive in a poverty-stricken condition, and how that struggle for survival could be an asset as we begin to implement real ideas and real policies to put a dent on and to alleviate poverty.
David, what people have to recognize is that the flip side of poverty is deprivation.
Mm-hmm.
We're poor because we're deprived of certain things. And although the focus has been, by implication, on money, income, and ability to buy goods and services, it also includes many other things. The poor are deprived of proper education. They're deprived of good health. They're deprived of good services that the state may have to distribute to its population because they are not within the preference group. So that poverty and deprivation go hand in hand. And it is not only a lack of income or even a lack of wealth, but a lack of access to basic necessities like education, schooling, sanitation, nutrition. All these things go to make up family having a good and satisfactory life in a particular environment. It is also linked to the environmental sustainability of the country, that floods don't dominate, that wildfires don't occur, that diseases don't flourish or run riot in the community. Pandemics don't become the order of the day. And for all those things, we need to have resources. And resources that will provide for those things include not only monetary resources or monetary benefits, but non-monetary attributions as well. A population is as poor as it is educated. If the population is dominated with poor people, it's dominated with half-educated or poorly educated people. If it's dominated with a lot of poverty, a lot of people are also suffering from sickness, malnutrition, diseases that are rampant in the particular community, when being malaria or whatever it is, are not so rampant in countries that have developed better distributions of income and less poverty among them. I think I was listening to the news recently, and I heard of 2 or 3 malaria cases in some part of the United States. Now, if that happens within any part of Guyana, it will make the news because it's par for the course. So that the poverty we talk about is linked to all those deprivations, the ability to get satisfactory services, to be able to live in good health, and to live a long and happy life.
Professor Clive Thomas here tonight as we continue our coverage, our focus on poverty. I'd like to welcome all of you to Politics 101 tonight, our open word podcast night with Professor Thomas. Tonight, we are talking about poverty in from all its angles, all the dimensions of poverty. And we are making the central argument here that poverty can, in the current Guyana, poverty can be alleviated, it can be decreased, not only in Guyana, but in our wider Caribbean, our wider CARICOM region, because of the new wealth that has come together. Happenstance. We didn't, 20 years ago, we didn't, even if we could, we didn't envisage a Guyana today that is going to have and does have more resources than it ever had in its post-colonial manifestation. And that in itself changes our country. In effect, what we are saying is that change is happening despite what else is happening around us. We have bad governance.
David, may I add?
Yes.
I use the opportunity to emphasize this point.
Yes, please do.
All this dramatic change you're talking about has happened between December 2019, I repeat, and today. Before December 2019, we found and produced no oil, no gas. So you see how much has happened in 4 years. Would you think of any other nation or where something like this has happened in 4 years? And then you get a sense of the scope and scale of the opportunities and challenges that face us now. This is a remarkable transformation. In the period of December 2019 to not even December 2023, less than 4 years, look how much has happened.
Yeah, and that profound point.
People never want to reflect on that. I'm saying it is so dramatic that it almost blunts your senses. That is why I think I was having a discussion with you yesterday. When I was preparing this for a study I'm working on, and I look at it, I've always admired the United Nations Human Development Report, as most people do, because it gave the first realistic look on poverty. And when I saw the table that they published on Guyana, showing an explosive rise from having a human development index of 0.5, something, I can't remember what it was, to 0.7 plus, I can't remember what it was. When the highest achievement is 0.8, makes me realize what has happened in 4 years. This is truly spectacular and revolutionary by any standards. So we can't treat in an ordinary way such dramatic changes. That's my view. I think that most of, even the people who are supporting Guyana, do not recognize how much has happened in such a short period of time.
Professor.
I mean, I myself have begun to doubt now whether the movement towards the idea of the World Bank and not so the World Bank, the UNDP, towards the broader poverty measures, has certainly not been helpful to our critics because it undermines all their logic.
Yeah. Professor, I want you to put your finger a little firmer on that point you raised there, because I think it's going to clear up some things for our audience and for ourselves. The government of the day is engaged in a very aggressive propaganda campaign that says that change that you're talking about, that change that is happening there, is as a result of President Ali, Vice President Jack Dio, and the People's Progressive Party.
One would have to be a fool to believe that could be true.
Okay, talk to me.
I'm
Talk to us.
saying, so it's easy to discount that.
Yes.
It has to do with the discoveries. It has to do with the global environment. It has to do with the conjunction, time, and the price of oil and gas, which means that the treatment of the assets have to reflect this environment. It's not a milking cow. It could disappear easily if the price of oil were to collapse. But it's a conjunction of events. The one thing to remove oil and gas from being a primary source of energy, another such thinking in some countries, among a large number of countries, and it's directly antithetical to that. The problem that we face is that here we have to take into account the geopolitical considerations. If the Democratic Party lose power in the United States, and what the Republicans are saying come to naught, all that price advantage and so forth will disappear, because they're not going to put any restrictions on the production of oil and gas. In fact, they say it openly, and they blame Biden, now the president, for allowing the United States to go on this, what they call wishful journey of trying to appease the woke arguments in the States. I don't want to go into them.
Mm-hmm.
And that this is purely an illusion if they come to power. They will pump oil and pump gas. And because transferring from one energy to another as the primary source is not a simple matter, plug and play, as they say. It needs a reconstruction of all the sources of generating and distributing energy. Like you hear now with the cars, the electric charging stations everywhere, people buying them and they're getting stranded without being able to reach a charging point because it runs out of electric power. So once countries begin to rebel against such a regime, then the transition will take longer and the price will persist at a lower level for longer. What is driving the prices now is the recognition that the transition as stated by the UN and those who are supporting the UN is supposed to be 2050. So we have literally just 2 or 3 generations or decades to get this thing changed over. It would be a tremendous setback in that regard. So it's an entirely new ball game that we're facing. So we have to take all those considerations into account before we can dance on Happy Street. And that is why I try to exhibit caution about the misuse of the windfall gains that we get. Because the biggest tragedy would be if during this period, you pump all that money down in the hole. But there's only one way you can get out of a hole if you keep digging. Bury yourself. The last thing you should do right in the hole is to keep digging. And if they keep digging, if they get into the hole to, let's say, keep sugar going or to build another oil refinery, then we waste the surplus that we get here now. And we don't even achieve the first task, which is to eliminate poverty.
Professor Clive Thomas here, and I want us to pay close attention to this aspect of the discussion, because we are not denying that large amount of revenue is coming to our country, and that all the indices are showing that our country is moving out of the state that it has been in. Those are irrefutable. But that change in fortune has nothing to do with the PPP. It has to do with the discovery and the pumping of oil. Where the PPP comes in, or any government comes in, is what they do with that revenue that is coming in. What they do with the position, the positive position that Guyana finds itself in. And I like what Professor said: if you dig a hole, the only way escape is to bury yourself. And I think that's where we have to focus our critique, is on the way the government is handling the windfall that has come, not to deny the windfall. That's the argument we are making here. Eh? Do not deny the windfall. The windfall is real.
To do otherwise is to fool yourself.
Yes.
And to fool your own supporters. And what benefit from any serious political movement can come when you deceive the supporters? We see it playing out in the States with the 91 Stop the Steal trials that Trump faces now.
Yeah. So the WPA is saying here, the windfall is real. Could we have gotten more? Of course, if the circumstances were different, we could get more. And we are part of the market. We are part of the whole larger way in which the industry operates. And if conditions were different, then we could get more, and so on and so forth. In spite of all of that, despite all of that, the windfall that is coming is real. And so it is what our government is doing with that windfall. What is it doing with that windfall? Is it spending on alleviating poverty? When the government presented its first budget, I remember speaking to Professor Clive Thomas, and he looked at the objectives, the 5 objectives in that first budget and the second budget. And the government stated its objectives. I remember clearly one of its objectives was something about democracy and going after people in the 2020 election. One of the objectives, none of the objective was about alleviating poverty. And I give that example to demonstrate to you where we are going with this discourse and this trajectory. What is your objective? What is your objective? Are you using the resource to keep yourself in power? Or are you rising above narrow partisanship?
Or to make yourself rich.
Or to make yourself rich, you and your friends.
Colleague.
Yes. And here is where we in the WP are urging the population to go, is to how do we, so on the one hand, we are pointing out that the government is not going in the right direction in terms of what it is doing with the windfall. But on the other hand, we are putting concrete proposals on the table. On the table. We're arguing in the public space for these ideas. We're arguing that poverty should be up there at the top drawer of the agenda. We're arguing that there are some things we must avoid. Avoid the government getting in to an oil refinery. We're arguing for a national oil company. We are putting concrete ideas on the table. If must be a critique in the government. And so that's where I want us to pay close attention to what we are advancing as far as the oil and gas industry is concerned. And that's why this series with Professor Thomas is so important. And that is why our focus on poverty is equally important. Professor, before we go, there has been a lot of talk recently about the withdrawing of oil blocks from those who were given the oil blocks, and some extensions were given, the government did not, at the end of those extensions or the end of the life of the period that they were given for, the government did not reclaim those blocks. Put all of that in context for us.
Well, we probably could have a little discussion of that next week, if you were intending to have another group.
No, well, yes, we can.
But I make the broad observation.
Uh-huh.
And within oil contracts, the general arrangement usually is one in which when a licensee gets a block, particularly a large block, is supposed to relinquish a portion of that block after a period of time in order to maybe rent out the block to another investor who might still think it has yield to give. Or in fact, the present investor who has the block may not have even reached it because it's so low down on their priority as a block to undertake seismic research. And in that way, you generate a maximum yield from the block in terms of exploration and discovery. So what has been happening is that the time period for some of these relinquishments and the amounts to be relinquished have not always been met as stated in the contract. Now, the government has raised exceptions in terms of the fact that COVID intervened and COVID placed an act of God constraint on the operation of the contract because nobody could have catered for it. And therefore, to hold them to this once in a century or century effect is a bit unfair. So they argue that the contract should give them an extension from the period over which in which they had to make the relinquishment. So it was supposed to be done by 2022, then they should have an extension to the end of 2023. But these things have all been settled in an informal way, or not settled at all, because we have not heard any discussion about them. And I think the reason why that is so is because the government ministries responsible for oil and gas have operated like most ministries in Guyana, where the minister himself or herself gets too involved in the running of the corporation or the ministry and become, in effect, part of the technical arm of the ministry. And things like that begin to slip. But if we have a professional technical class running the ministry and responsible for those decisions and those recommendations and those evaluations, reported to the minister. And the minister keeps an arm's length away from getting involved in the technical areas of work. Types of that, symmetries of that type will not occur because most project managers work with tight schedules and they know that important things like that As soon as they come to their desk the next morning and they open up their schedule, they'll know that 3 months and 3 days from today, you have to meet this relinquishment deadline. And it will always be in their mind. But the minister doesn't operate on those principles. He may not be, or she may not be, involved in the delicate day-to-day, week-to-week, period-to-period, even with our management of the ministry and their operations. And things like that could slip. So I feel that the error is caused by a fundamental flaw that we have encouraging Guyana of ministers becoming walls in the ministry and getting too involved in the day-to-day running of the ministry and less involved in the strategic thinking and advice and policy direction. That's my general explanation. Some people see as more sensitive than that the ministers may want to appropriate, for whatever reason, monetary, friends, or political support, their right to be able to steer the benefits from any particular decision to their constituencies from whom they are operating and on whose behalf they are operating. And that might be the motive. But that is a stretch to make an accusation. Because once you begin to do it in the ministry, you open yourself up to be able to prove it. So it remains a matter of some concern.
Professor Clive
That's
Thomas,
what I think is the source of the problem.
yes, Professor Clive Thomas here introducing the notion of the risk of over-politicization of our oil and gas industry, and that politicization could be intentional and it could be unintentional, but it is obviously something that is of significance. And when we come back next week, we are going to get our teeth into that. The risk of the over-politicization in a partisan way of our oil and gas industry. That risk can range from who gets the oil block. It was drawn to my attention that Vice President Jack Dio admitted that only people of one ethnicity, for example, were given license to these oil blocks. That he admitted that. Was that intentional? Was it a consequence of the broader focus of the government? We are not making any determination here, but we are making the point that the over-politicization of the oil and gas industry really could be a challenge. Professor Clive Thomas, thank you again for coming through and for bringing to bear your expertise and your reasoning on our discussion.
Good evening.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us on this beautiful Monday evening. And see you all tomorrow. I don't remember who we're going to have on tomorrow. I think it might be Dr. Henry Jeffrey. But thanking all of you for joining us on our Monday edition of Politics 101, the Open Word podcast with Professor Clive Thomas, with Professor Thomas. See you all tomorrow.
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region for the woman and we